This video is a little different than my usual fare. Normally I do videos about RPGs that aren't D&D because that's a niche I think that needs to be filled. This is more of a video essay about why I'm filling that niche, as opposed to jumping on the D&D bandwagon and trying to compete in that arena. The short version is that Dungeons & Dragons is the big RPG that everybody knows, and it kind of obscures everything else. And I don't think that's very good for the hobby, because D&D really only does D&D. And thus we're stuck in a catch-22 of people not knowing of D&D's shortcomings, since the only way you can really understand these shortcomings is to play something else. But to be able to play something else, you have to know that something else exists. Which is unlikely that you'll be able to, since everyone is playing D&D. Either because it's all they know, or they don't realize there's other ways to deal with D&D's shortcomings. We're gonna explore some of the ideas about what happens when a market only has one big player, and how that tends to kill diversity. At least, that's what I'll hope I'll accomplish with this. More realistically, it'll probably just be a bunch of angry anarchist noises and bizarre metaphors and comparisons that nobody asked for. Let's start this off by taking a look at some of the data gathered by Roll20 in June 2018 about games that have been played at the start of that year. As you can see, the lion's share of what's being played goes to Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Meanwhile, D&D 3.5, along with its bootleg knockoff Pathfinder, combined to take another significant but smaller bite out of that. This means that about 3/4 of what went on Roll20 during that time was some form of D&D, with any game that's worth noting being lucky to have 1% of the whole community, if any at all. This isn't a perfect data set, mind you. It only counts one platform and it requires people filling out data correctly on Roll20. Which, as you can see, I did not do for this Data Toko Saga game that I ran, or any other game I used Roll20 to host for that matter. Mostly because Roll20 does not support entering custom values for that field. Imperfect as it may be, it is a good indication of the overall trend in the RPG community. Dungeons & Dragons is king, and this data is consistent with how many new people are constantly entering the fandom from this or that actual play podcast about Dungeons & Dragons. As most people seem want to do, since even I started with Dungeons & Dragons some 20 years ago when my sister taught me and my brother AD&D 2nd edition. At this point, I think I can safely say that Dungeons & Dragons is the Coca-Cola of role-playing games. It has brand recognition, everybody vaguely knows what it is, and it's often used synonymously with similar products, even when it's clearly not the case. You wouldn't refer to ginger ale as Coke, but there are some people who apparently do. I'll be forward. I don't like the single-mindedness the larger RPG fandom has for Dungeons & Dragons. It does make sense though. D&D is the only RPG that has that kind of brand recognition, and even though Cyberpunk 2077 is getting really popular right now, the mainstream isn't referring to its inspiration, Cyberpunk 2020, as a role-playing game like they might with Dungeons & Dragons. They're constantly calling it a board game. D&D is the major entry point, and since it has such a big share of the market, it's easy to overlook other RPGs, or just not think of them as the same thing. It's like a shopping district with one major road leading into it, that has this huge, sprawling department store right at the entrance that has everything the average person could need or want for sale. There's other stores, sure, but they're so small, and some of them actually are just a cart on the side of the road. They can only be seen if you enter through one of the back roads that people seldom talk about. They also typically deal with either the same stuff you can get from the major store, but are probably knockoffs. Or they only deal in one specific kind of item, and despite having a great selection in that one item, you'd still need to go to a different store if you want something else. You can get a bicycle and some basic stuff you need to repair, maintain, or even modify it from Walmart or Target. You can also get all the stuff you need for a camping trip too while you're there. Though the moment you head to a shop dealing exclusively in bicycles, you you gain the added benefit of having a mechanic on site that can modify your bike for you, and you also have access to other specialized equipment for getting the most out of your bike. But it probably costs more, and you also can't get your camping gear from there too. It's like wanting to run a game of D&D about modern-day vampires blending in with mortals, and using the materials presented in Curse of Strahd to include the bits about vampires. It's technically playing a role-playing game about vampires, like buying your biking gear from Walmart technically gets you a bike. But playing Vampire the Masquerade gives you more depth and options for really playing up being a vampire, like getting your biking gear from a bike shop. Yes, there will be brands you're unfamiliar with in the bike shop, just like how Vampire the Masquerade will have rules that you're unfamiliar with if you've only ever played D&D. But you'll get more mileage out of the rules specifically about being a vampire in the modern world if you're playing Vampire the Masquerade. Maybe shopping for bicycles and biking gear and camping stuff isn't the best comparison to RPGs. So let's compare RPGs to another medium of game: video games. Dungeons & Dragons is a bit like Minecraft. Both of them are staples of mainstream geek or nerd culture. You've got a lot of people publicly playing both games like a spectator sport, while the capacity remains for people to play privately with their friends. There is a lot of personalities, big, small, and unheard of, that like to discuss what can be done in both of them. There's many different, officially supported ways to play either, and even more ways to play them if you're considering mods for Minecraft or homebrew content for Dungeons & Dragons. This particular final point of comparison is the source of a lot of frustration for RPG fans that don't like playing D&D. It's led to an in-joke in some communities I'm in, where whenever a game is described, somebody will chime in with, "But can't you already do that with Dungeons & Dragons?" The joke is usually followed up with an obnoxious list of supplements, splat books, or some other kind of homebrew module used to accomplish this. For example, Tenra Bancho Zero. If I wanted to play that, I'd just play D&D Oriental Adventures while using Eberron's hero points in my own homebrew for cyborgs and giant robots, while making everybody pick ninja or samurai as their class. For us who make this joke, it's mainly born out of a frustration of having people rebuff our desires to share our games with others, or to otherwise have the games we like dismissed, sometimes with those same sort of very statements and sentiments. It'd be like if somebody were to say, "There's no need to play Final Fantasy XIV if you have Minecraft and install this sorcery mod." Technically, yes. You would have swords, bows, monsters, dungeons, material gathering and crafting items, and magic in both games with that mod to Minecraft. But the way either game handles either of those things is pretty wildly different from one another. A game's mechanics and rules do in fact matter and change the experience. Mods or no, you can't say that you get the same experience out of both games just by changing one or the other. And tabletop role-playing games are the same way. Conflict in D&D is resolved differently than in Tenra Bancho Zero. D&D has a simple roll 20 and add some numbers, compare that to another number. Sometimes another person's D20 roll with their numbers added to it. Tenra Bancho Zero, by contrast, uses several six-sided dice, and you count up how many are below a certain number, and you compare how many like that you have to another number, which could also be somebody else doing the exact same thing. By virtue of the dice alone and how they're used, by virtue of how the dice are used, you won't be able to get the same experience in both games, no matter how much you alter or homebrew one to look like the other. But I get why somebody into Dungeons & Dragons would be reluctant to switch to something else. D&D takes a lot of time investment to learn. We, as people, don't like feeling incompetent, and learning something new is a fast way to hit that feeling. Moreover, D&D has a lot of material published for it, and there's also a sort of do-it-yourself culture surrounding it. This is a hobby you can feasibly spend a lot of time playing just one game. I definitely understand why somebody might want to stick with just one game for so long, perhaps even indefinitely. And if one's only experience with role-playing games is Dungeons & Dragons, It'd be easy to make the assumption that any other RPG would take a similar investment before you could feel like you know what you're doing. Whether or not that's actually true or not is irrelevant, since there's great rewards to be had for the brave few who can cross that threshold. Humans are creatures that crave variety, which is why we want to try new things with D&D, official or not. But even that can only sate that desire for so long. Consider the story of one of my friends. She spent 10 years playing Dungeons & Dragons 3.5, the edition often regarded as the one with the most options. Towards the end of that time, though, she was getting bored with Dungeons & Dragons and role-playing games in general. In the end, it was all the same, and soon she was just going to give up on RPGs. Until she found a different RPG that caught her attention. Tenra Bancho Zero. It was new, unusual, and did all kinds of things that you simply can't find in any other version of D&D. As anybody who's strayed outside of Dungeons & Dragons is quick to learn, people willing to take on the mantle of GM is difficult to find. So this was also the first game she decided to run, and since then she's become a very prolific GM, having run numerous sessions of numerous games, some short, and some that have gone on for years. In other words, it opened up a whole new world for her, because once you step far enough past that veil of Dungeons & Dragons, you learn just how much difference there can be between two different RPGs. And even if Dungeons & Dragons remains your favorite, playing or running something different can still give you a new perspective on what tweaks you can make to it, because different games can present different methods of accomplishing the same goal. This brings to mind some old cliches.
Variety is the spice of life, and man cannot live on bread alone.
I'm normally opposed to the idea of conventional wisdom. I don't always find it to be so wise. However, this is one situation where I can agree. If we do want to realize the potential of tabletop RPGs to see what they can really accomplish within this hobby, from time to time, we do need to be exposed to new ideas, new ways of doing things. Dungeons & Dragons has its own cliches, and I've noticed that some people tend to get trapped in them. Like how a character's class determines their behavior or personality, or magical items that effects consistently are described as,
once per day, you can do the thing that does 2d6 whatevers.
Or alignment and its legion interpretations, misinterpretations, and reinterpretations that lead to numerous arguments, some that last for hours or even days. The most bizarre thing of all of it, though, is this. Many of these problems don't exist once you leave D&D. Because other games just don't have the rules that make them possible. But if one doesn't step outside the realm of D&D, it's easy to believe that this is the way all RPGs are, or that many of Dungeons & Dragons' idiosyncrasies aren't a problem, or worse, that they're the best way to do something. For example, is metaphysical plateaus really the only way to express character improvement? Is rigid collections of abilities earned along these plateaus really the best way to make characters for these games? I could describe what something is like all I want, but you get a different sort of understanding by experiencing it for yourself. So, for those of you who've only played Dungeons & Dragons, go out there, learn or play some new game. It'll definitely change the way you see role-playing games. And if you don't like the way the other games do things, you can always go back to Dungeons & Dragons. Even though D&D will be sure to change in due time. Dungeons & Dragons has gone through at least 5 editions after all, and every edition ever since the third has been wildly different from the one that came before it.